All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session on generative AI and finance. I'm very excited about this session. I think we have just about the perfect lineup of topics and expertise, and I think we're going to have an amazing 2 hours. Sendhil, who's going to be our first speaker, will actually need to bow out a little bit early because he's also our distinguished lecturer speaker today, which starts right after the session in the other hotel. So we all can stay for a few extra minutes and then walk over to see more of Sendhil's work. So our 3 amazing panelists today are in this order: Sendhil Mullainathan at University of Chicago, John Horton at MIT, and Erik Brynjolfsson at Stanford. The plan for today, because we do have 2 hours, which is quite long, so we're going to make it lively by splitting it up into a few different formats. So we're going to start with individual pieces. So everybody's going to get to present a bit of their topic with individual Q&A. So this will be 20 minutes per speaker, so about 12 to 15 minutes of talk and about 5 to 7 minutes of questions. So that's going to take about the first hour. After that, we're going to move on to a more discussion format, which will start with some general discussion questions from me to our panelists, and then from all of you to our panelists. So we are going to have quite a bit of Q&A time for both individual presentations and also general questions that everybody on the panel can speak to. Before we go into all of that, I'm going to take my prerogative as the panel chair to set up the stage a little bit, to give you a bit of an overview of the different areas we'll cover and kind of what we know there and what we're going to learn during the panel. So of course, there's a lot of discussion in the media about AI, the impact that AI is having on firms, on their products, the impact that AI is having on labor, whether it's going to displace workers, whether it's going to augment workers. And there's a growing literature on this as well. So to set the stage, I just want to define a little bit of what is AI, right? There's the kind of the sci-fi vision of superhuman intelligence that takes over the world, and then there's the practical side of what actually is there under the hood, which is algorithms that make predictions from data, and that are able to make predictions from large data, that are making predictions including complex nonlinear relationships, and are able to process not just increasing the size of the data, but also increasingly varied formats of the data, visual, language, and so on, for prediction, for then correspondingly decision-making, and so on. There's been an explosion in corporate interest in AI, roughly sort of once a decade, so to speak. There was the precursor in 2012 with AlexNet, largely precursor to a lot of the current innovations, and then, of course, 2022 with ChatGPT. So throughout the 2010s, we saw an increasing interest in AI in the commercial space, and then in recent years, that has just exponentially risen even further. Now, this session is on generative AI. Why is it on generative AI? Well, for 2 reasons. First, we already had a session on AI and finance at last year's AFA, so we had to, move on with the times and do something a little bit different. And second is that is what's on everybody's mind these days. That is the latest sort of innovation, the latest kind of set of methods and use cases. So what do we mean by that? What is generative AI? Well, if we think about AI as sort of a prediction machine, generative AI is where you take that prediction and use it for generation. So now you're not just predicting, what was that data point, should it have been labeled as positive sentiment or negative sentiment, but you're predicting what might come next and using that to generate and create new content. Generative AI in its current sort of incarnation, of course, uses large data sets and correspondingly very heavy computing resources, more so than some of the older methods, and can perform more varied tasks. Now, some of the open-ended questions here is, does that mean we're going to see a democratization of access because everybody's using ChatGPT? Or does it mean we're going to see increased concentration because some firms own more and are kind of disproportionately benefiting? Does it mean we're going to automate more human tasks because we haven't seen that much automation in the first decade of AI use? Does it mean that we're going to finally see increases in productivity because we also haven't seen that much productivity effect in the first decade of AI use? I'll show you just a couple of graphs and sort of what we saw in that first decade and set the stage for what we might expect in the next decade. Now, in general, AI investments have benefited firms. This is from my work with Tanya, Alex, and James that looked at the effect of AI investments on firm sales, employment, and market value. All of them have gone up. This is over the course of about 8 years, in the course of a decade. So about 2% growth per year for firms that invested in AI versus firms that didn't, roughly speaking, doing kind of per 1 standard deviation change in AI investments. Those gains have not been equal across firms, though. They've been larger for larger firms. So here we're sliced by firm terciles. Smallest firms haven't had that much of a difference, again, in that first decade, between firms that used AI more and firms that used AI less. Large firms, they did. Is that something that might change with generative AI? Can maybe inequality reducing as all firms start using it? Or is that something that's going to stay because, of course, generative AI relies a lot on computing resources, and those may be easier to obtain for larger firms? So again, an open question. Now, zoom in on the middle set of columns here. We also didn't see a decline in employment in firms that are using AI. In fact, employment increased, especially at the larger firms that have been using AI. And even at the industry level, we see that as industries invested in AI, we actually saw increases in employment, which is different from some of the evidence that has been documented for, say, robotics. That's something that we've seen to date across most industries, but not all industries. And there were tasks that already in previous years have been automated with AI. For example, audit. The number of auditors has gone down in the audit firms that invested in AI throughout the 2010s. As we move on to more generative AI, more varied tasks that are being performed by AI, more adoption, more use, are we going to see more tasks automated? Or are we going to see potentially augmenting those tasks, making them productive, and then generating new tasks? And so employment may still be growing. So that's, again, an open question that I think our panelists are going to have a lot more to say about. And then finally, one other puzzle that I alluded to at the beginning is that so far we haven't seen that much productivity improvement. So we've seen growth. Firms that invest in AI, they grow. The workforces are actually growing as well. There is product innovation. This is this slide here. There are sort of more product patents, more trademarks by these firms. But we don't see effects on productivity. So simple things like sales per worker, they're staying flat because sales are going up, but employment is going up about the same. And so sales per worker are starting flat. Revenue, total factor productivity, also, we don't see effects there. Because again, the costs are rising just as the output is rising. And even process patents, much weaker effects than product patents. There's evidence by Daniel Rock on null productivity effects, and of course, Erik's work on productivity J-curve, that maybe it takes some time. As we get into this new wave of AI with generative AI, are we finally going to get out of that J-curve? Are we finally going to see productivity effects? That's another thing that I would be very interested in hearing more about from our panelists. And then finally, I want to conclude with just kind of a little more of a generative AI specific example. And that's a paper that I have with my colleagues Ulrike Malmendier and Ali Kakboen, and a PhD student at Haas and Peiyao Li, where we run side-by-side experiments, similar to John's work, on individuals and on generative AI instances, looking at their investment preferences, so how they feel about stocks, how they feel about bonds, how they feel about cash, and looking across the demographics, right? Because we know there are differences in demographics in terms of things like stock market participation. Men participate more than women, and wealthier individuals participate more than poor individuals, and so on. So we have kind of 8 demographic groups, 3 asset classes, and we can look at how well the ratings correspond. And the answer is very well. So they have about a 70% correlation across demographics between the ChatGPT responses and the human responses. What was more surprising to us, and I think more promising, is that we also asked for open-ended why explanations. So each participant in each instance of generative AI were asked, why do you rate stocks so highly, or why do you rate bonds so poorly? And those actually match really well, too. So the free-form explanations, the main themes, as they should be, are risk and return. And those match between the human sample and the generative AI sample in terms of how they predict the actual ratings. So per, say, one standard deviation increase in the positive perception of return, both people and ChatGPT agents increase their ratings of stocks by like 0.7. So you can preserve the structure between the reasoning and the rating. You have the same additional themes outside of risk and return, which is knowledge and experience. And this was perhaps the most surprising to me, is that the relationships between the themes within response are also preserved. So it's not that some of the draws talk about return, some of the draws talk about risk, some of the draws talk about knowledge, some about experience, but they talk about the themes in the same way together. So if the response is talking about good past experiences with the stock market or being familiar with the stock market, they're more likely to also talk about having a positive expectation of the return, both in the human sample and the ChatGPT sample. So this also raises some questions about generative AI for us as researchers. To what extent can it be used to, say, replace surveys, to pilot experiments or pilot surveys, or to potentially uncover underlying mechanisms for why people rate some things positively or have negative expectations about other things. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of setting the stage and let our panelists go a lot more in depth on each of those areas. So the methodologies, the labor effects, the productivity effects, the firm level effects, and so on. So we're going to start with Sendhil.
It's terrific to be here. I wish Anastassia hadn't explained why I have to leave early. I was hoping to leave in a huff after John said something, making it appear that he and I have a beef. Because we do have a beef. No, we have no beef. So let me dive in. I'll be very brief so we have time for discussion. What I want to do is I want to just talk about three things about generative models in finance. And I want to think about everyone in this room as potentially filling three roles, one of which you're probably very familiar with, which is as a user of LLMs. But I hope to also argue that I think there's a role for you as a evaluator of LLMs and a role for you as a producer of LLMs. And so I'll try and walk through each of these and give you a sense, but let's start with the one that's most familiar to you as users of LLMs. And the way I think about this stuff is there's a lot of excitement over language models, and it's really hard not to be wowed by them. And I think you've seen, John is, I think, one of the best people at this. Every time I see him tweet something or say something or a paper, it's just always so creative. I just think there's been a lot of creativity unleashed. And as an empiricist, just have to set the stage by saying, I think creativity in empirical work is fantastic. And when you have a new tool, any amount of pushing boundaries is great. And we've seen a ton of boundary pushing. So we've seen sort of labeling text, which Anastassia had mentioned. We've seen, why is this going, there we go. We've seen people using it to make predictions. We've seen it as decision aids, inferences, judgments, simulating human subjects. And every day there's some quite creative use case that is coming out. And I think that's fantastic. What I want to do is to say something that I don't want it to come off negative, but I want to say it's the flip side of creativity, which is while these are exciting times, it's also hard not to feel something else, to not have a slight nagging worry in the back of your mind. And that nagging worry is this okay? Like, can I just take this output that this model gave me, put it in a regression, call it a day, and say that's my standard error? I don't know, we spend so much time everywhere else being so careful. Can I just do that? Is that okay? And I'd say this question of, is this okay, is kind of the core question underlying us as users of LLMs. Is this okay? Is the particular use that you have a reasonable use? Are your standard errors properly sized? Should you somehow account for the fact that there is LLM output in your estimation and somehow adjust your standard errors? Maybe adjust your estimator? Or is it all okay? And what I want to tell you is, we're not going to get an answer to the question, is this okay, in one go? And that's because the history of econometrics is always a history of empirical work and the creativity in empirical work outstripping past the formal models we have and the formal models having to catch up. I'm going to try and tell you one approach we've taken in this paper that we just finished to give you a sense of where I do think we've already learned something. And I'm not going to go through the paper. I'm just literally going to talk you through it You can look it up in the paper, but this will give you a bird's eye view, and I'm happy in the panel to discuss it. So what we do in this Is This Okay paper, that's not what it's called. I wish it had been called Is This Okay? That'd be a good idea for a paper, wouldn't it? That'd be a great title. Oh, anyway. What we try to ask is, how would you build an applied econometric framework to answer the question, can I just pop the LLM in? And there's some ground rules I just want on the table. For those of you who have any familiarity with econometrics, you know that what econometrics models is a data procedure. OLS is a data procedure. That's all it is. You know what else is a data procedure? A large language model is just a data procedure. That's all it is. So in principle, these things should be very friendly to the methods of econometrics, but they're actually not. And they're not for two fundamental reasons. OLS is a data procedure whose inputs we control and we understand. No one in this room has any idea what goes into the inputs of a large language model. For example, most of you probably think that the key to a large language model is next token prediction, and that where it gets all of its energy is from the corpus. Fewer of you are probably aware a big part of LLM, industrial level LLM production, is human feedback, where they get tons and tons of human labels, well past the timestamp in the corpus. So you think it only knows stuff up to date X, but human feedback has been going on well past date X. That's just one little thing. These are private companies. They have no reason, they don't need to tell us everything that happens under the hood. You cannot reject the hypothesis that they're going and monkeying around and changing individual things for individual problems. Probably not, but we wouldn't know. So that's one reason it's hard to model these from the inside out. The other reason it's hard to model these from these inside out, there's no way to put it other than these are insanely complicated, and if you could actually model the asymptotic behavior of a large language model, you would have solved foundational problems in computer science. We are not going to take asymptotic theory and throw it at LLMs and get anything out. That's crazy. So what we need a way to model these as black boxes and appreciate how we can use them despite recognizing they're just black boxes. And it turns out we can. Is this okay? Depends on use case. Suppose what you're using it for is you're giving it a piece of text or a large corpus of text, earnings announcements, and you want to use those earnings announcements to predict some outcome. So have it label the announcements, take the embedding of the earnings announcements, take the embeddings of the 10K, whatever you want, and use it to predict some outcome, future returns, for example. That is totally fine under one condition. It's a very simple condition. It should be familiar to all of you. It is a no leakage condition, that the LLM cannot have access to data from the period in which you are looking to predict into. Then it is not predicting. Now you may say, oh, that's obvious. How would you enforce this condition? If you use ChatGPT, how are you enforcing this condition? If you are a referee for a paper using ChatGPT, how are you enforcing this condition? Oh, well, it said in their thing that the corpus only is up to I just told you they use human feedback. So this is a problem, a major problem for the use of AIs in finance. And it's a very good paper worth reading by Sarkar and Vafa. I think there's a positive answer to this one. I left out that slide. The positive answer is open source language models are fantastic because they are time-stamped. They're exactly time-stamped. You know exactly what went into their training. So this suggests, at a minimum, we should be using open source models with known timestamps. But there may be other solutions to this. The ball is now in your court to decide how you're going to argue there's no leakage happening. The second use case is what I call estimation, which a lot of things fall into, where you give the LLM pieces of data, take this earnings announcement, this headline, say, ask the LLM to label that headline for sentiment. And now you have a large data set on sentiment. And now you will use that data set on sentiment for something, whatever you want, as the left-hand side variable in a regression, as the right-hand side variable in a regression. It's a plug-in estimator where the thing you are plugging in is the output of the LLM. The temptation here is to say, I'm just going to use it. The challenge is we have no idea of the quality of that model's sentiment analyzer. Without that, you actually have no way to put any sort of standard error on whatever plug-in estimation that you do. And it's worse than that. For example, if you simply just redid the model again with a slightly different prompt, you'll get different labels. And you'll get different coefficients. Say you did it with an older model, a newer model. Say you just ran it several times. There is variation here that comes from the fact that these models, even in their reported performance of, say, as a sentiment analyzer, no one is saying they are perfect. So that variation must be accounted for. Otherwise, at that point, it's unclear what we're studying. There's a way to do this, very straightforward. Collect the data, the ground truth data, that you think is the ground truth that the LLM is approximating. Whatever you think that is, I don't know what that is, that's your business. You just say this is the ground truth that it's approximating. But once you have that, now actually this is not a weakness, it becomes a strength. If you collect 200 data points of ground truth, we present a technique that allows you to combine the LLM labels with the ground truth labels and have a different estimator where you're able to magnify that small amount of data quite a bit and lower your standard errors quite a bit by modeling the relationship between your ground truth, whatever you claim is ground truth, and the LLM's output. You can actually then boost whatever small amount of ground truth data you have. What you can't do is you can't just say, I collected the ground truth, the correlation between the ground truth that I have and the LLM is 0.95. That looks good to me. I'm just going to run it on the original. You can't do that. That is wrong for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to go to. But it is a sample booster. And so I'll just conclude on this by saying we're starting to get, I think, a little bit of traction on the econometric side of how we can have the benefit of the creativity that on the one side we can just run with it, but have also the guardrails that I think we need as researchers to ensure that we're getting robust estimators. Great. The second thing, evaluators of LLMs. Here I'm just going to make a pitch to you that I think we all should enter the evaluation game. And I'm going to make this pitch to you by showing you why the evaluation game is a big deal. And then I'm going to show you one little project we did, not because I think you should follow, I mean, I think you should follow up on that project. I think it's interesting, but that's not my point. My point is that, as you will see in that project, if we can do something that trivial, then there's a lot left to be done. Okay, so why do I think evaluation is great? Well, all of you have seen these impressive metrics like this. The left is the one that came out when ChatGPT came out. The right came out when Gemini came out. And these are all metrics on things like Big Bench, MMLU. Has anyone here, raise your hand, opened up MMLU or Big Bench? No one? Some of you have? I mean, we're all convinced that they must be doing amazing things because they did well on Big Bench. What is Big Bench? It's worth looking at. I think you'll find it very interesting. The other reason that I think we're all impressed by large language models is what I would call wow examples. I don't know if you all have an example like this. I would encourage you to just play with ChatGPT until you produce your own example that makes you go, wow, that's amazing. It's just worth having one. I have one that I've stolen because I haven't been able to produce one better than that. This is from this paper on sparks of AGI. Can you write a proof that there are infinitely many primes with every line that rhymes? There's a little footnote to this one, which is I think I used this in my talk for about 6 months before I realized the question itself rhymes. I don't know what that says about me, but... And in fact, GPT-4 does produce a valid mathematical proof that there are infinitely many primes that also rhymes. This is astonishing. This is not anywhere in the training corpus. It is the intersection of two different kinds of schematic knowledge. What constitutes a valid proof that there are infinitely many primes and what constitutes rhyming meter. That's astonishing. I also would encourage you to play with ChatGPT until you find what I will call, in this slide I call it in my head I call them goofy examples. So I did this with my undergrad class. I had them just generate red team it. And my favorite one from the class was this one. I think it'd be hard to beat this one. So she asked ChatGPT, suppose given, or might have been Gemini, suppose you're given the following information for train, car, and metro. Travel times are $3.95, $80, $92, it costs $29. Which mode of transportation should I use? Can you help me choose? It says, great, I have you. Here's what I want to do. We're going to calculate cost per minute. Having calculated cost per minute, trains are a fantastic deal. Look how many minutes you get for so cheap. Enjoy your train ride. So this is the LLM conundrum from where I sit. The LLM conundrum, and I think what I mean by this is, I don't mean as a user, I meant in the core of computing, I believe there is a conundrum, which is, we have impressive metrics, we have things that wow us, and we have very goofy behavior. What constitutes a proper evaluation of LLMs? How am I supposed to know if they're working? We don't know. One reason we don't know is I wasn't being snarky about MMLU or about Big Bench. No one in this room is ever going to use an LLM for anything that is in Big Bench. I promise you this. There are questions like, this is how many figurines are on the table. Tell me how many mammals there are. Now, I don't know about you, but I suspect very few of you are counting mammal figurines on a table, much less of the two of you who are doing that. I hope none of you are using ChatGPT, but so what can we do? Well, I actually think we're in a pretty good position to answer this question. And the reason I think we're in a pretty good position to answer this question is because the only evaluation metric we have available to us right now that's very robust comes from the world of supervised learning. Create a fixed distribution of instances and test them. But of course, that's not what makes ChatGPT fantastic. It's not a fixed distribution of instances. It's the wide variety of use cases. And once we're in the world of wide variety of use cases, we've sort of entered the social science of it all. So let me just tell you an obvious thing. We could just start by asking, how does a human being decide where to use ChatGPT? Well, I suspect this is what you all do. You play with it, and then you say, based on it doing this, I think it's going to be good at A but not B, or 1 but not 2 and 3, and good at 4. In other words, what people are doing is they're sort of forming an inference function. They're making inferences based on their experiences as to what it will do well and deploy on instances where it's thought to be accurate. Now, what's interesting about this problem is that this is just a function. I'm going to call it the human generalization function. The human generalization function is an object that we can actually measure. So we collected a ton of data where we told people, on this question, the algorithm did this, how well will it do on this question? We can actually measure people's generalization performance and fit a predictive model. It turns out that you can very well fit the predictive model of human generalization, and it does a pretty good job. Once you fit it, I'll skip this. It actually has a lot of structure that's kind of obvious. There's also another thing about it that's obvious. The human generalization function works extremely well for humans. On the x-axis is people's belief about how well they think the thing is going to do. On the y-axis is how well people actually do. That's the blue line. And you can see people concord with our beliefs about how well the person is going to do based on what else they've done. Unfortunately, the confidence does not track at all for LLMs. And simply scaling the models as we go from llama of 7 to 70 billion does nothing to this form of generalization. Why is this problematic? Well, here's a good way to think about this. What consequences does this have for deployment? Imagine I just assume and simulate a situation where people try some questions, they form confidence on accuracy of others using this generalization function, and then they deploy to the instances where they think the model will do well. Okay, that's it. That's all I'm going to do. And I'm going to take this, I'm going to simulate how well different models do under this generalization function. Notice how this is different than a static test distribution. It is a situation where the test distribution responds to performance because the person changes their mind as to where to use it and not use it as a function of performance. Now, that could be a good thing, but you should get a sense of why it may not be such a good thing. So here in this table, I've shown you what happens, and the results depend crucially on how important the task is. These are 50-50. So if you could care less, if you're happy with the flip of a coin, ChatGPT, GPT-4 does very well. If you care somewhat, 95%, GPT-4 is still the winner. But if you care to get it really right, all of a sudden, in this scenario, Alpaca, the smallest model, arguably the worst model, is the best performer. This is not a spurious result. This result that statistically better LLMs will be worse when deployed by people is actually a theoretical result as well. And here's how you can see why it's very intuitive. Remember how I showed you the LLMs were not aligned with your intuitions? That means when the model improves on a particular question, it's making an implicit promise that it will do better on the other things you think it's going to do, but a promise it will not fulfill. So improvements on questions without commensurate improvement on the things that you think it implies will always lead to this kind of performance. It's a overgeneralization by you, but it's not an overgeneralization by you. It's an underalignment by the LLM because it is doing the kind of thing that many of you are probably aware of, such as it's able to answer math Olympiad questions, yet it fails on a big fraction of 4-digit multiplication questions. The unpredictability of these models will inevitably lead to bad behavior as they do worse, better and better. So how to fix this problem? Well, LLM alignment is an area in computer science that's very common. There are lots of kinds of alignment, value alignment, but I think this kind of alignment is an important form of alignment in which these models should be aligned to our sense of generalization, and what it requires is an estimate of the human generalization function. I'm walking you through this paper because I think this topic is important, but also because you can see there is nothing we did here that was not bread and butter social science. And we fit a supervised learning model to the data we collected to fit the human generalization function, but that's not hard these days. So there's really nothing here that's not bread and butter social science. Yet this is a paper that's having some impact in computer science because everyone needs to understand evaluation. Some of the most important papers in the last few years have actually been on things like how do we get human feedback labels? How do we evaluate when humans are in the loop? So that's my pitch to you, that I think you all should be evaluators of LLMs, and I think that area is particularly important. I'll conclude by arguing why I think there's at least some argument for being producers of LLMs. I started by saying in finance, information leakage is the single biggest concern. Finance is a big enough area that I think there is an argument for saying the field should build its own large language models that is very carefully constrained, that has all the things. This isn't that expensive, especially since I heard that companies in finance have money and would find this a valuable activity to fund, but I'm not sure if they have money, but I've heard they have. Turns out the way to have a lot of money is to be near money, and I think these guys are near money. And it's not unheard of. So if you look in other fields, protein modeling is an example, medicine is another example, there's been quite a lot of work and quite a lot of argument for building these domain-specific models, and I think finance would benefit tremendously from that sort of activity. Okay, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
So before we proceed to our next speaker, let's have a couple, just two questions about the topics that Sendhil has already covered. Do I see a hand in the back? Yes, go ahead.
So, great talk, thank you. My question is about a word called, you mentioned, like, domain specific, but finance touches all aspects of the world that we live in. So what do you mean when you say domain specific LLM for finance? Thank you.
I think I don't know what I mean. I'm just throwing words out right now. But I think that's something for the field to come to some collection. I could imagine a world where the field decides we truly are about everything. I can also imagine a world where the collected works of Shakespeare and Chaucer and poetry and iambic pentameter, that there's just a whole amount of things that are not that relevant, and that instead the model should be more narrowly focused on For example, having a good reading of 10K forms, et cetera. So I think there is an issue to decide what is the scope. And I think if you just look through the training models, training data of a bunch of these models, I suspect you'll find there's a bunch of things that are not really that relevant for finance. And there is just a huge gain in actually focusing on the things that are relevant for finance. And so you just have to remember, these are true general models. And so literature is probably the easiest off the top of my head example that I could give.
And was there one more question? Yes, please.
Thank you for the nice talk. Indians are overrepresented in questions, so I'll keep it short. In economics, we only get transaction data. We don't get non-transaction data. So LLM has opened a door to think about the demand schedule and the supply schedule and look at what the guy could have done. So there is a bit of uncertainty in this, but an initial promotion to get into sophisticating the models to reduce the error, as you specifically, I'm agreeing, is more of a nuanced approach than like questioning what to use and when not to use. Because we were, for a long time, limited by only transaction data.
I without question, I think that the ability to use language data, use image data is just fantastic. It's amazingly useful, and we should be doing it. Yeah, I don't mean to imply we should be in the game of where not to use, where to use. I merely mean to say that empirical work has as its bedrock being able to be precise about what are the objects we're making inferences on, and how do we know we've made the inferences that we have made. And that is the heart of any statistical exercise. By all means, I think people should be more adventurous than they are.
Thank you. And with that, we can move on to our second panelist. John, please.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so I'm a labor economist, and I was kind of asked to kind of talk about the labor aspect of things here. I should say that this is how I feel being on a panel about AI with Erik and Sendhil. I'm the goofy dragon here, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And like a economist, maybe like a first-year grad student who's feeling nervous, I'll retreat back to a simple supply and demand diagram to kind of frame my talk. So I want to talk about the supply and demand of financial services and try to map some of this to what we think these models do and what they're good at, and also maybe what they're bad at. So I think on the supply side, and here I think we could, kind of thinking about people working in say, the financial services industry, there's this question about like, well, what are the tasks that they do, and will we see complementarities or substitution? Are there new tasks that might emerge? And then also, what kind of negative cost shocks might we see? Then I'll talk a little bit about the demand side of things. And finally, kind of like what's not captured maybe by this particular framework. If you go to, say, ONED or the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you start poking around financial services occupations, it's like a long list of things that these models seem to be quite good at least on the face of it. Analyzing data, writing reports, making predictions, summarizing information. So, it's not like we're talking about a sector that is not the kind of thing that these models tend to be good at. So I think it's reasonable to think that this is where we might kind of see big effects. One of the economist's trick with trying to deal with any new technology is to kind of try to boil it down to say, oh, this is a shock to this kind of cost, or this is a substitute for this kind of worker. And I think what's challenging about generative AI is that it's pretty difficult. Even Sendhil kind of showed, like, it's hard for people to even reason about, well, if it's good at this, it must be good at that. And so it kind of defies sort of easy classification. This is a model that I've used. It's a simple diagram that, if you imagine any job as a sequence of tasks, we take one task in that sequence and we say, is this the kind of thing that maybe AI could be helpful for? The first step is to try to ask nicely and say, hey, can you do this task? Or let me try to get you to do it. The model will almost always return something, but whether or not it's good, it depends on the quality of the model and how good your question was. And then finally, we have this step of judgment. Sendhil's kind of paper and discussion, I think, made this very clear that we often have a hard time with this, but some of the tasks, we know exactly what right looks like. If you say, hey, write an agenda for a meeting, I can look at that agenda and say, yes, this meets my needs. It seems like the dangerous area is when we're asking it to do things that we ourselves aren't capable of doing. And what kind of tasks fall into that bucket is ultimately an empirical question. But we have this judgment that we have to kind of make a decision. Is the output actually valuable? And the big question people always have about these things is like, well, is this a substitute or a complement? Even if we have the AI doing the task that we thought that the human was doing in the past, there's at least 3 parts of this that are new complemented human skills. So, one, there's just this meta skill of recognizing that this is a task that AI would actually do well at. One of the challenges is like for a technology that's moving so quickly, kind of keeping track of what kind of tasks these things are good at is practically a full-time job. And you kind of have this like rapid improvement. But this is like, I think, probably the first task, first human skill that potentially is complemented. Then there's this kind of managing the AI and kind of guiding it. We've all had kind of multiple years now of working with these things, and I think we've probably collectively gotten a lot better of like, hey, you can, if you give some examples, maybe you give some negative examples, you get better at it over time. There is a human skill in working with these things. And then the final skill here that gets complemented is judgment, right? And just knowing sort of, hey, this is an output that's actually worth kind of continuing on. So that's all kind of like pretty static, kind of looking at the things that people do right now. If you take, ONET, you're kind of looking at things that are already done. The biggest unknown with a technology like this is, what kind of products, services, features don't exist, and probably because human time was too expensive, right? So, it's easy to imagine now, and I'll probably describe something that exists. There's already some startup working on this, but you could imagine saying like, hey, take a high resolution video of your car or your house, and I'll take and write an insurance policy for you. Or, you'll agree to have an LLM-based arbiter, and we'll save money, but you have to agree to be bound by its decisions. Or, some kind of an agent that's doing, say, like investment type decisions. I think this is kind of a little bit of a stupid exercise for me to list these out, because the reality is, though, is that this is where entrepreneurs will come up with things and try them in the market. And I think that this is why people tend to always miss the complement story with new technologies, because it requires inventing the future, and you can't just sort of invent the future, as kind of up here on a podium as someone sort of not in the game. But I think we can be pretty confident that we will see new tasks, and those tasks that emerge will probably be taking advantage of the fact that now you can get intelligence on tap, essentially, for the cost of electricity. This is all kind of positive. I think one of the more negative things that I don't think we've kind of fully wrestled with, and I think this probably will become more and more important in the future, is that the potential for fraud and misuse. It kind of like went a little bit under the radar, but one of the most notable frauds in recent years was actually done with the help of a somewhat primitive generative AI model. So maybe some of you saw this case where JP Morgan bought a company that supposedly had lots of email addresses, and in fact they were fraudulently generated by a data science professor using a generative AI model to make up millions of email addresses that didn't exist. And now you can do this at home. You can go to Claude and say, hey, make me fake email addresses. This kind of technology is now kind of in everyone's hands. And to kind of harken back to a point that Sendhil was making, I think for research purposes, open models are fantastic. I think that they're the future. It's inevitable that they're going to spread, but this also does put sophisticated tools in the hands of bad actors. And it seems like finance in particular is an area that could see big sort of shocks. So this is kind of, I think, I'm not going to summarize it, but I think if you do imagine that this is a big productivity boost, right, to the individual productivity of the labor supply in the sector, then the big open question becomes, well, what do you think is the elasticity of demand for financial services? If it becomes a lot cheaper to do these things, how much more of it gets bought? I don't know, but that seems like the big open question if it ultimately has a big productivity effect. So let's just talk briefly about the demand side of things. One of the things that I wonder about a bit is, how much sort of home production might we see in sort of financial services? So, I would say hallucinations aside, most advanced LLMs probably offer better financial advice than the modal human financial advisor. I kind of did a little exercise with Claude. I said, how much should I be paying for active management fees as a percentage of amount invested? I mostly invest in index funds. My financial manager says 5% of the capital is quote unquote standard. And Claude wanted to flash a red light and tell me that this was extremely high, that I should not be doing this, and kind of went through. And then I said, well, I'm actually paying 6%. What emoji would you characterize your feelings about my situation? Just one emoji, please. And it gave me this oh my God. So it's got a little bit of a sense of humor too. This is kind of a funny example, but even in my dad runs a construction company, and he was using it to help him make a spreadsheet to do a lease or buy decision on a piece of equipment, and it was helping him make the spreadsheet. That's the kind of thing that maybe a few years ago he would have called up his banker or something. Now kind of those sort of services are kind of just out of the box with these models, and so I do wonder how important this is likely to be, but it seems potentially important that a lot of things that maybe we would have relied on talking to someone at a bank or whatnot is now kind of just in the average person's hands. So, one thing that I think is also worth talking about with any kind of new technology is how much of this actually lowers the cost of producing valuable things versus sort of moves around who gets what or creates kind of a zero-sum arms race. I think we, especially IT professors, like to think of IT as mostly having a beneficial effect on market efficiency. Here's a chart from Rob Jensen's QJE paper showing, price dispersion kind of goes away when the cell phone gets introduced in the phishing market, and we're kind of all excited about this. But there's also kind of the dark side. This paper by Erik Brynjolfsson about how high-frequency trading is really kind of dissipative and doesn't really improve allocative efficiency, and a better design would have been helpful. I think then the question becomes, well, where would this arms race actually take place with AI? We're just kind of guessing. But one thing it allows you to do is research and data collection analysis at a scale that was sort of previously infeasible. And so, I just as an example, I asked Claude, how big was the Enron email corpus? And it was about 500,000 emails, I believe. Right, that talked about different aspects of what was going on. You could have the most advanced LLMs read every one of those emails for about $1,300, and it could do it in 2 minutes. Right, it's like an easily parallelizable task. Costs are falling, but I don't think we kind of fully have grasped how easy it is to take video, text, audio, and kind of analyze it at scale. If you're talking about a place where small differences in kind of the availability of information or the quality of information can make big differences in sort of outcomes, this is where you think an arms race might happen. Okay, so the big question I think we all are kind of wondering, is this all a good thing or a bad thing? I don't think we really have much to do. We won't be able to shape it that much, but I think on the positive, it does seem like there's likely to be these literal cost reductions, probably tempered by fraud. We'll probably see new interesting contractual forms, new products, new services that are probably exciting. But this kind of cream skimming or arms race stuff doesn't seem sort of second order either. So I'll conclude with the never controversial, much research is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
There's a lot of things that AI can do in finance, and it's great to have a chance to connect to all of you about this. And particularly, I've been doing some work on intangibles and returns there. But Anastassia asked me to talk about productivity in particular, and so I'm going to look at it first at the micro level and then the more macro level. But just first, a little bit by way of background, as you guys know, there's been a lot of hype about AI, but there's also some metrics of just remarkable progress. One way to keep up with it is this AI index report that I and others put out every once per year, and it's 520 pages filled with charts like this one of just progress on MMLU and lots of other benchmarks, but also a whole bunch of economic metrics, bibliometric metrics, and other kinds of measures of AI progress. So as you can see here, I mean, on these different technical benchmarks, there's been a lot of progress, and it seems like it's almost happening faster and faster in many different ways, becoming close to human level in many categories that previously we thought were almost impossible. Going back to ImageNet back in 2012 when they first started using deep learning techniques. Another report I just finished with the National Academies has a lot more on the economic and societal side. The National Academies asked Tom Mitchell and I to co-chair a committee on AI and the future of work. And that's only about 130 pages, so a little more digestible, that you can go through about summarizing some of the things we saw in a number of different categories of economic impact. But let me talk a little bit more about how I see AI affecting productivity. And for me, I like to start with what I call the task-based analysis, which is not trying to look at the whole economy or entire firms or even occupations, but going down very fine-grained into individual tasks. A job can be thought of as a bundle of different tasks. And so if you use the ONET taxonomy, for instance, a radiologist might have 25 or 26 different tasks, economist, a couple dozen tasks, truck driver, et cetera. And you can go more fine-grained if you want. More recent work, we're using natural language processing on job postings and resumes. You can look at hundreds of thousands of very, very fine-grained tasks. Once you have that very fine-grained taxonomy, it's a lot easier or more sensible to say, well, could an AI tool help with that particular task? Not the whole job of being a professor, but maybe writing a memo or lifting a box. And once you have those tasks evaluated, you can aggregate them back up. You can weight them perhaps by time spent or by wages or by some other metric to the level of the job, economy, region, et cetera. And so this is an approach we've been using a lot in some of our analyses. Starting back in, I guess it was 2016, Tom Mitchell and I first wrote this paper where we analyzed the effect of AI and machine learning on lots of different tasks. And as many of you probably know, it has about 18,000 of these tasks. So to take the case of, say, radiologists, there are 27 distinct tasks according to ONET. And Jeff Hinton said that, hey, we don't need radiologists anymore because AI can do radiology. But at the level of the whole occupation, that's not actually that useful. It's true that this one task, interpreting images using computer-aided detection diagnosis, can now, in many cases, be done as well or better by AI systems. There's been a lot of papers where they compare humans and machines and that. But there are all these other tasks that also radiologists do, some of them more important, some of them are less important. And you wouldn't necessarily want the AI to come in and administer sedation to you in your office or to conduct physical exams or some of the other things that radiologists sometimes do. And so what we find is that even as AI is able to help with certain parts of the job, there are other parts of the job that you still want humans involved. And for that reason, we now actually have more radiologists than we did when Jeff Hinton made that prediction in 2016. And there's still strong demand for them. But which specific tasks will be affected? So there have been a number of papers. Perhaps one of the first and best ones was this paper by Ilandu, Manning, Mishkin, and Daniel Rock, GPTs or GPTs that came out earlier this year, which estimated that about 80% of the workforce could have at least 10% of their tasks done. And 19% of the workforce has at least half of their tasks potentially done by large language models. Interestingly, there were more tasks in the higher income jobs than the lower income jobs. And that's a little bit of a reversal from some of the earlier technologies, which tended to affect lower paid jobs or middle skill jobs, the so-called polarization that David Otter and others have identified. So this is affecting a different part of the workforce, maybe not the very highest end, but the middle to high end of the workforce disproportionately is being affected. It's also often a complement, which, as you might imagine from what I said earlier about the radiologist. So we did a study looking at call centers where we looked at how LLMs were being used to help them answer questions more effectively. So a question might come in like the one at the top there in red, and then the LLM would give a couple of different kinds of answers. This one's from a company called Cresta. And what we found, and the nice thing was that they rolled it out in a phased way. Some people got access to it, some didn't. It was pretty much random who got access to it in these different categories. And there was a very striking difference in terms of how much better the people who had access to the tool did on a dozen different performance metrics in the paper. Here's one which is how many resolutions per hour. And you can see with the red line, the people who got access to the technology very quickly started outperforming the people who didn't have access to it. Within just 4 or 5 months, they were on average about 14% more productive, some of them 30% or more productive than the others. We also found that the customers liked it better. The customer satisfaction went up. The net promoter scores were higher. Customer sentiment was better if you looked at how many sort of happy words versus angry words in these conversations. Even the employees seemed to like it better. They were less likely to quit, and the turnover went down quite a bit. So all three groups, the stockholders, the customers, the employees, seemed to be better off. Interestingly, we were worried that this would sort of de-skill the workers and have them just sort of mindlessly answering the same way as the LLM. It turned out the opposite. The LLM helped them learn good answers better, and they retained that a bit. And we discovered that through another natural experiment. Sometimes these systems just crashed, and not so good for the company, but great for us as researchers. We got some data about how people perform when they suddenly didn't have access. And as you can see, when they did have access, getting access to it significantly improved their performance. But when there's an outage, those same people who had previously had access, it's a lot noisier because we didn't have quite as much data. But I think it's fair to say that on average, they did better than they did before and better than the other people did, not as precisely estimated. So they kind of learned some of the information. They had been getting feedback every time a question came in. And that was a lot better than previously, where they would only hear from their manager once a week or so. Another interesting finding was that the lower skill agents tended to do better. So we put it into 5 quintiles, and we see that the lowest skill agents had about a 30% improvement. The top agents, really, there was no significant improvement whatsoever, maybe even a little decline. What's going on there? I think David Otter described something called Polanyi's paradox, where you often know more than you can tell. In traditional coding, it's very hard to write down knowledge if you can't express it. But AI systems maybe overcome that to some extent by capturing the tacit knowledge of these best workers and making it accessible to others. The AI scans through millions of these transcripts and finds the types of responses that work well, and they share those with the less skilled workers. The high skilled workers were already using those responses. And there's also a distribution of tasks where they work well. If you divide the questions into, how often they appear, of course, some appear more often than others. How do you change your password? The AI was better at the most common or middle frequency questions. It wasn't very good at questions that never appeared previously in the data set. There was no training data. We humans did better on those. We're not perfect at dealing with exceptions and improvising, but we're better than machines are, at least for now. So there's a natural division of labor there. There are many other examples of these rapid gains that now in the study in coding and writing, management. One of my favorites is a new paper just out by Aidan Toner Rogers, which found that researchers using an AI system had about 44% more material discoveries and 39% more patents. Although unlike the call center operators, they were not happy, or they seemed to dislike working with the system. So maybe their previous they liked it better before they had the system. So how is all this aggregating up? In Silicon Valley here, people are always telling me that progress has never been faster. They're all very enthusiastic and optimistic that every year things are getting better and better. Let's see what the overall data show. Well, actually, it's not so encouraging. Back in the 1990s, productivity grew about 2.6% per year. Since then, since 2005, it's only grown about 1.2%, less than half as fast. So we've had a significant slowdown in productivity, not just in the United States, but in many other economies as well. Now, the last year, the last quarter, it does seem like it's doing a little better. Last year was 2.7%. Last quarter was 3.2%. Too early to say that that's a trend yet, but keep our eyes on it. There are lots of other reasons that productivity bounces around. Why have we had a bit of this slowdown for this period? One argument is that we're not measuring things correctly. There's a lot of digital goods being produced that aren't being captured in our financial and economic metrics. And as a result, the official measure of the information share of the economy, despite all these new goods, has been basically flat since the early 1980s, maybe gone up a little bit. So that's, I think, suggests that we're not capturing all these free goods and services that are being there. That's part of the story. The other part, and where you have a new metric called GDPB, which is seeking to measure that by measuring the value that people get put on goods, even if they don't have to pay for them. We ask people essentially, like, how much would we have to pay you to stop using Wikipedia or Facebook for a month? And that gives us some estimate of how much people value them. The other reason is that AI is a GPT. I used to be confident people would interpret that as general purpose technology. It's also a generative pre-trained transformer. But GPTs take a while to pay off, and that's because of these intangibles that I mentioned earlier, that whenever you have an important general purpose technology like the steam engine or electricity or AI, you need to invest in a lot of complementary, often intangible assets in business process redesign, new organizations, new firm-specific skills, and these are not often captured in our official output metrics, even if they are important contributions to our intangible capital stock. As a result, measured productivity tends to be underestimated while you're making these investments, and then later, when you harvest them, productivity starts taking off, at least according to the official metrics. So you get kind of a J curve, which is what we've seen in many of the previous instances, and we calibrated this, Daniel Rock and Chad Severson and I, measuring this J-curve effect for a bunch of different prior technologies, and I suspect it's what's going on to some extent with the latest wave as well. Finally, let me just wrap up by saying that AI is not just a GPT. Perhaps it's the most general of all general purpose technologies. After all, as Demis Hassabis here says, the goal is to solve intelligence and then use that to solve all the other problems in the world. I'm sure you each have a mission statement that's equally modest. But there's a little bit of truth to it. If you could solve intelligence, whatever that means, you could do a lot for the environment, for labor, for healthcare, for lots of other poverty, for lots of other challenges in the world. I'm not saying it would by itself solve it, but it would make a lot of progress on it. So it could be, some people call it the final invention, and that makes it perhaps a particularly interesting one for finance and economists to think about is what does this mean for the economy? Let me just skip this slide in the interest of time. We're putting together a program to look at this economics of transformative AI with a bunch of AI researchers and also economists, and think more carefully about what kind of data we would need to think of a world where AI could do a large percentage of the tasks that humans, cognitive tasks at least, that humans are doing, and maybe some of the physical tasks, developing theory, simulations, getting a community together. And those of you who are interested in this question of transformative AI that has that kind of impact, please feel free to email me and contact me. I'd love to get more people involved in that program. Here are 8 questions that we're addressing. We have a white paper that should be done within a week or two to be able to share, that Anton Koronek and Ajay Agarwal and I are writing to talk about these ways that transformative AI will likely affect the economy, and think through what some of the implications are. So if you want to read more about that or download those reports and papers that I mentioned, here are some of the URLs and websites to do that. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions or comments.
Erik.
Are you going to be equally shy? Who's going to come to the... There's a question over there.
But there was nobody in the second time, which I gave up.
We all appreciate you.
Thank you. So this is a very interesting finding and makes me think that how micro-level data you have. One of the finding is that low-skilled workers are gaining more.
So the what?
The low-skilled
Yes,
people
that one,
are
yeah.
gaining more. You know, that's
Right.
very interesting. Because see, always the philosophical debate is whether the poor got the opportunity but did not grab it, or they did not get the opportunity to begin with, right? So giving them a cheap tool is
Yeah.
showing that they're generating, you know, high returns out of it,
Right.
which is kind of giving a testimony that they are actually, they are constrained to get those, you know, high-end, expensive facilities, right? So the micro level, what kind of micro level data
Yeah.
you have on this is something that I will be very curious.
It was very striking, and it was a little interesting and surprising. Once I saw it, it kind of made sense because of the reason that I mentioned about capturing some of the tacit knowledge. And I should say that some of these other studies found the same thing. So 3 of the 4 of these also found similar things in the coding, the writing, and the management consulting. They also found that the less skilled workers benefited disproportionately. But Aidan Toner Rogers found the opposite in the science study. There, they did a randomized allocation of the tool to different researchers, and in that case, they found that the more skilled, the more researchers who were previously more productive got a bigger boost than those who were less productive. So I don't think this is necessarily any kind of a universal finding yet, and it would be interesting to understand better when AI can help level the playing field or help less skilled workers, and when it boosts the people who are already doing well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Francesco Bianchi from Johns Hopkins. So my question is also related to the previous talk. And in fact, also about the very last question. So this is a bit of a static view, in the sense we have certain tasks that are currently available and we are currently covered, and some of them will be replaced. But then correctly, it was pointed out, we'll probably come up with new tasks, new business ventures, and so on.
Yes.
And so I guess it's inherently very hard to predict where this will bring,
Yeah.
even in terms of redistribution between high-skilled workers, low-skilled workers. Yourself, you pointed out there is this massive underwater investment that goes on, and of course that requires, in a sense, skilled workers. So when I teach the Kalman filter, I always tell my students that they had to code it once. They will never have to do it again, but
Right.
once they need to understand what's going on,
Right.
because that's the only way they can interpret the output. So I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of where we'll go in terms of new skills.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I agree that it's a lot easier to get data on things that people are already doing, and so there's a natural bias towards that. ONET has a taxonomy, and you can look at the existing tasks, but much of the value, I would argue most of the value comes from new things, doing new things that we never could have done before. In my article, the Turing Trap, I tell a little story about just a thought experiment. Daedalus was an ancient AI researcher who made robots that were supposedly humanoid, and I think it was a myth, but the question is, suppose that they had successfully automated all the tasks that the ancient Greeks had done very successfully, but only the tasks the ancient Greeks had done. Well, the good news is we'd have as much pottery as we wanted. If you felt ill, you'd get incense smoked for you automatically, and you could get tunics. But you can rapidly see that really wouldn't be that big a boost in our living standards. Almost all of the reason that we have vaccines and smartphones and jets is because of new things that the Greeks never had before. And if we wouldn't want to make the same mistake and only focus on thinking about things that are already existing and just how we can bring the cost down, most of the value is going to be coming from those new goods, like the scientific discovery that Aidan Toner Rogers found. But as I think John was pretty eloquent in just saying why it's difficult for us to imagine what those new tasks are, and if we do, we're probably wrong. A lot of smart entrepreneurs are trying to figure that out, and many of them fail. But that's the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean we should ignore that possibility. maybe we should open it to general
super.
questions.
Yeah. So I guess the second half, slightly shorter half of our time together, I want to start by asking a few general questions to each of the panelists. So this is going to be kind of the phase where everybody gets about 3 minutes per question. And in the meantime, think about general questions that you would like to ask to the entire panel. So I'm going to start with the first question. Going back to kind of some of the things that I showed back in the introduction in terms of how well LLMs do in matching human preferences across demographics and perhaps the reasoning behind them. What I didn't show you back then is that if we don't tell it the demographics, then for an investing question, 55% of the time it answers as a young, wealthy male. So it overwhelmingly overrepresents the group on which it was presumably trained more. So the question is about algorithmic bias and how concerned should we be about algorithmic bias. Now, of course, as I just illustrated, it depends on the prompt. It depends on the training data. But sort of what are some of the largest concerns? What are some of the areas that we should be especially potentially worried about? And what are some of the best practices to avoid those pitfalls?
Who should start?
Whoever likes to. We can go in order or out of order.
You're the expert.
Sure. Also, I would really separate out the algorithmic bias discussion into two different discussions that tend to get conflated. One discussion is in the context of supervised learning, where we've got a clear outcome, we have a thing we would like, some good we're allocating, and we worry that that good is being unfairly allocated by the algorithm. That case is a case that I think by now today we have now fully understood that, I mean fully, as pretty far as one can get in a short amount of time, understood that case. And I think I can summarize that case by saying a big part of what we would call algorithmic bias comes from misspecified objectives, and that's basically the problem. You gave the algorithm the wrong label to predict. You didn't specify that your objectives included equality. And so that's more, I would say, like writing a piece of code with the wrong specification. And so I think people are becoming very careful about giving the proper specification. I think the second case is in the case of, say, language models, but it's deeper than language models. Like an example you all might have encountered, if not, it's kind of interesting, was for a long time, if you went to Google Images and typed CEO, you got only men, white men, and if you type nurses, you only got like women. And there are non-female nurses and there are non-male CEOs. It was just a weird thing. And so that's not a supervised learning task. That's a different kind of task. It's sort of a representational task where the algorithm is doing some representation of reality. It's easiest to see in Google Images. It's that the world that is implicitly represented by the algorithm to the user is different than the world we think ought to be represented. And I think for those representational biases, we've really not made much progress that I know of in like really nailing it. I think we've had a lot of progress in showing that they exist, but in trying to think about how to uncover it, I think that proves very hard. If you haven't seen this, there was a big fiasco, I think, is that a good word, with Gemini, where it was pretty clear they were like, oh, we better do something about this. And it was pretty clear whatever they did was almost comical. If you don't know this, you should look up Google Gemini racial bias. It's actually quite funny. I think the comedy is high there, yeah. But yeah, I think that's right.
So let me weigh in. So there are some horrific examples, and Sendhil alluded to a few of them, of AI not only perpetuating bias, but amplifying it and spreading it and creating new kinds of bias. But a lot of it comes because how is it trained, whether it's with the original corpus or the RLHF, it's on humans. And sadly, we humans are pretty biased, and so it'll capture a lot of that, like Anastassia was saying, in terms of what kind of investment advice it assumes that you need. That said, last year I was doing congressional testimony, and the three other panelists were so worried about algorithmic bias. They were basically saying, let's shut these things down until we can prove that there's no bias anywhere. And I really think that's the wrong approach, because you have to think, compared to what? And here I'm going to be an AI optimist. Kahneman and Tversky, lots of people point out that the humans are really biased. When you go to a bank or a medical office or you're hiring or parole officer, there are so many terrible examples of humans being biased in all sorts of weird and sometimes funny, if you're not the victim, ways. But compared to them, I think there's lots of research, including work by you, Sendhil, that shows that the AI systems can do better than the humans, have better outcomes and less bias at the same time. There's not even a trade-off. You can do better than them. In parole, hiring, lending, medical, there have been examples where this has been shown. And I think ultimately it's easier to fix an ML system than it is to fix humans. You can use something, my friends at the Media Lab had a tool they called the Turing box, where you put in, millions of resumes with all sorts of subtle characteristics and then see how they do. It's hard to do that with a judge or an HR officer, and then you can go back and fix and find these subtleties that hadn't existed before. When you start doing that, you realize that actually some bias is inherent, that there's many kinds of bias, and if you eliminate one kind of bias, you're going to be stuck with another kind, and it's sometimes mathematically impossible to eliminate all of them. So it forces you to be explicit. Okay, what kinds of trade-offs do we want? You can literally turn some dials and say, okay, we're going to have fewer false positives, but we're going to end up having more false negatives as a result, or whatever the trade-offs you want to have. And it makes you be explicit about those. But ultimately, I'm sort of thinking that this is going to be more of a solution to bias than something that makes bias worse in our economy. Not a solution, but a mitigator of bias rather than an amplifier.
I'll take a slightly different interpretation of the question to think about, like, when we're using these things, say, as like stand-in for humans in simulations or explorations like that. I think the bias you often encounter is that if you're asking GPT-4 to pretend to be a human, it's like nicer and more cooperative and better than real people are, and won't make mistakes that humans typically will. And so, like, RHLF is kind of the enemy if you're trying to create an agent that you want to stand in for a person for some purpose. I think the future is probably open models, but I think that often what we're trying to do is think of this less as do these particular models match people, to an engineering problem of, can I make an agent that reflects some population that I'm interested in because I want to use them to study things computationally that I couldn't study in a lab or something like that. So I think I think actually the future of kind of combining these things is going to be very much hybrid, where we'll use humans, we'll collect human data, we'll combine it with LLM data, we'll like recalibrate our LLMs to be like the humans that we're interested in, and then we'll kind of use all the kind of computational advances that they offer. So it's we want to eliminate bias or possibly even induce bias to get more realism in the agents that we're using. But I think I just wanted kind of what Erik said, I think is really a great point, that you can actually simulate and try these things out and sort of kind of characterize what the bias looks like and log it in a way that you can't do with people. And that's one of the things that I think is particularly exciting.
Thank you. That was a great combination of complementary perspectives, exactly as hoped for. So I want to also ask about a different concern, I guess, a more finance concern, which is concentration and market power. So I think one of the most common questions I get when presenting work on AI is, are the effects all driven by NVIDIA? And you always have to exclude this couple of firms. So, of course, there are the producers of AI tools, NVIDIA, and OpenAI, Microsoft, that are getting the predominant chunk of the benefits from the new tools, but also among the users of the tools, or at least kind of some of the earlier evidence on AI, we've seen uneven gains, that companies that have more data might be able to have tailored models, companies that can afford more computing might be able to have larger models. So there is an association between AI adoption and increased industrial concentration. So I want to have your takes about, is this a concern going forward? How might this change with the advances in AI? So there's some disagreement about whether generative AI will actually level out the field. Among workers, we see some of that in the presentations, where the lower skilled workers might benefit. But is that what's happening among the firms? And should we be concerned about then monopolistic power going forward?
I can start with this one. I think it's a huge concern, and it's one that you laid out well in saying that there are these two domains. The simpler one to see is what's happening with AI developers, and the scaling laws will tend to drive you towards more concentration. There are other sources of economies of scale. So we see these billion-dollar data centers. It's very expensive to be a frontier player. That said, the countervailing force is that open source models can be very good, practically as good or even better, as Sendhil was saying, in lots of situations. And I don't think we know yet exactly what the balance is going to be of those. Obviously, the people who are investing tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in the superscalers are assuming that winner take all or winner take most is going to happen. So I wouldn't dismiss that. And at one of the earlier sessions today, James Munica from Google was saying he doesn't think that the scaling laws are slowing down, that they're still quite important. So that's just on the developer side. The other 95% of the economy is I think, in ways even more relevant. You can think of a battle between Friedrich Hayek, who talked about all the dispersed knowledge in the economy and the need to have dispersed decision-making because nobody had all that detailed knowledge about what kind of toothpaste you wanted in your local store or where that half-empty truck was, versus Sam Walton and his team, who have created, maybe the most command and control economy in the world, most successful, where all sorts of information is being sent to Bentonville from RFID tags and lots of other information. And there it's analyzed in these giant data centers. And arguably, they know better than that local grocer what the demand is in that market and which trucks are half empty and should be used. And so this assumption that all the knowledge and decision-making needed to be dispersed that was true for the 20th century may be less true in a world of very powerful AI and information systems. And in fact, the data suggests that it has been going that way. I happen to have that data here. So in retailing, concentration, the big box retailers like Walmart, the concentration went from about 10. The top four had about 10% of the market in 1980, and it's up over 40 to 45% of the market now. So there's just been a monotonic increase. We'll see if that continues. Since this is finance, in finance, let me see, it's a little bit small here. My eyes are not as good. It went from about 20% to about 35% for the C4 concentration. So we are generally seeing more concentration in the economy. There are lots of reasons that may be happening, but I suspect that technology is a big driver of that, and AI may amplify it, and that could be a problem.
Sure. I think probably one of the most important things around concentration, I think we've benefited from the last 2+ years of intense competition between very well-resourced companies. Google sort of invented most of this technology and seemingly kind of sat on it and kind of didn't put it out there in the public. And then OpenAI started eating their lunch, and now we can see these companies competing very sharply for talent, for resources. And I think, ultimately, we're the beneficiaries of that. And so I would worry, it's not that people don't have real concerns about, algorithmic bias or AI doom scenarios or labor market concerns, but I do worry about that being used as a pretext to stifle competition, because I think that the companies would absolutely love it if there was like restrictions on what you could do, and it becomes impossible to start a new company. So, I'm very bullish on open models, open standards. In our own kind of neck of the woods, I think we should try to embrace open models, develop our own models, because sustaining that kind of competition is, I think, really critical. And it'd be sad if we kind of went to a world where we don't reap a lot of these benefits because everything gets so concentrated.
Nothing I'm going to say is more interesting than that.
Fantastic. So that very naturally segues into my last question before we open it up to the audience, which is about regulation. So Erik has mentioned the congressional hearings, and John just alluded to potential anti-competitive regulation that some of the companies may lobby for. So I would be really curious to hear what your stances are on sort of both the normative and the descriptive side of AI regulation. So what, if anything, should be done, and what do you think likely might be done? Now, of course, this is also a fraught political time right now, so speculation is maybe kind of has wider standard airs on it, but I'd be curious to hear your takes.
I think you're the expert on this one.
I don't know about that. Okay, I'll dive in. So let's think about the rate and the direction. So we know that there's hundreds of billions of dollars, we just talked about it, being spent on advancing the technology. There's very little, if any, there's a little bit, but almost nothing spent on understanding what the economic and societal implications. I think that gap is really big. It's getting dangerous. There's a lot of people here at the ASAA meetings, but if you've ever been to NeurIPS, that's a really big conference. That's one of the many big conferences of ML researchers. And because of that gap, a lot of unintended, maybe even some intended negative consequences are happening in misinformation. These systems are hacking our system one, figuring out how to get us to do things that may not be in our long-term self-interest. They're changing the nature of our relationships with each other. There's millions of people who have AI girlfriends and AI boyfriends. And I was talking to Alexander Wang. He thinks it'll be tens of millions within a few years, that their primary relationship is with an AI for better or worse. One can create novel pathogens and all sorts of abuses along those lines. And then there's a whole set of unknown unknowns that I don't know what they are, but I just think we're going into uncharted territory. I know that people like Jeff Hinton and Joshua Bengio and many others are concerned about some catastrophic risks. Now, this is a bit of a counter-argument to the open source, earlier when I talked about concentration being a good thing, but open source can make it hard to control some of those risks. So, we're kind of caught in a little bit of a dilemma there. Another thing that looms very large in all the conversations is national security. The one thing that congressional folks and the administration pay a lot of attention to is the threat from China in particular, or just national security issues. I was just at a meeting of the economic statistics for lunch, and someone pointed out that, if you want funding, go to the Department of Defense. That's where you can get better statistical data. I think the best approach is for us to think, not necessarily to slow down the technology, but think about ways we can speed up our understanding. I wish maybe this is self-interested, but I wish we would invest more in economic statistics and economic understanding. And I'm glad that there's so many of you here at this meeting right now, because this is something that I think desperately needs more attention. I'll just say a brief bit about the direction as well as the rate. On the direction, what I'd like to see is us to do more to make AI a complement rather than a substitute for humans. Either thing could be very productive and create value. I have a paper called The Turing Trap that basically argues why it's a bad idea to make AI that closely imitates humans. First off, it's kind of a low ceiling. No offense to the humans in the room. But just as Henry Ford, if he had tried to make a vehicle that walked as fast as humans, that would have been a little bit unambitious. But perhaps more importantly, if you have an AI or any kind of system that very closely imitates humans, it reduces the value of human labor, and humans' labor is inherently decentralized, and decision-making is inherently decentralized when humans are in the loop. But if a single company could do all of that, then it's not so clear we're going to have decentralized power and decision-making the way that I think most of us would want. Right now, we currently actually put our thumb in the scale in favor of automation and substituting capital for labor. Taxes on capital are lower than labor. So if an entrepreneur has two different ways of doing something, the government says, we'll tax you less if you do the capital-intensive way versus the labor-intensive way. I don't see that that's a smart strategy. So there are some things we could do. Even if we don't know for sure what these future things are, as John was saying, we could still, in the spirit of, say, carbon taxes, kind of try to steer decision makers not towards having capital replace labor at quite the same rate.
Sendhil or John?
Yeah, I want to pick up on just some themes Erik alluded to. I feel like when you look at the discussion on regulation, to my eye, it doesn't actually match what good regulation has traditionally looked like in any sector that is very well regulated. Because the bedrock of regulation is not prohibitions against things and things for. The bedrock of regulation is measurement. It is just not possible to regulate anything that you do not measure. It doesn't make any sense. It's not even possible. And just to underline what Erik said, there's not any discussion of what should we be measuring about this without any view toward just what are the things we should be measuring in hiring. What should we be measuring about the algorithms that are being used? In the uses of generative AI at places like what should we be measuring about the queries that are taking place? There is just not, and at least I haven't seen, a discussion on measurement. And it seems to me you just cannot have, it's like a pyramid. Measurement is the wide end of any regulatory pyramid. It's not the interesting end. Everyone wants to look on top, but without the bottom, there is no top. And so I think for me, that's the conversation first that's missing. And one reason the other reason I think that's important is, I think, Anastassia, you alluded to this, which is if you just go back to 2020 and you look at everything that people were saying about AI then, 2020, it's not a long time ago. And then suddenly everything changed because of LLMs. But yet somehow people feel like even though this field has had these radical revolutions several times now, this is the last one. We're done. There's no more. It's all going to be predictable from now on. There's definitely not another big advance that you didn't see coming. That's just an absurd way to approach this problem, which again leads you towards trying to set up a framework where you're measuring and you're being adaptive, and we're not in any way setting ourselves up for circumstances where we know are going to constantly evolve. And I think this is not just a failure of regulation. I don't even think investors have taken this approach appropriately to sort of say, this isn't the last big thing. There are going to be other big things, likely, and how can we be flexible in the face of that? So I would say measurement and flexibility are the two things that I would emphasize.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like something that's changing at a rate where trying to put in stone, like, okay, this is what we're going to do. It's just very difficult and probably premature. I would say the other thing that, we're kind of talking a little bit about policy, is try to think of like, what are policy levers that we actually have? Like, I feel like we're a little bit in like kind of the rush of history. Like a lot of the things that are going to happen because economic forces that are way beyond anyone's control are going to push for certain things to happen. Like, I agree with Erik. It would be nice if these things complemented human labor, but I'm also skeptical of our ability to really shift that. Like if it becomes very profitable to replace, that's where kind of VC money will go, and maybe on the margin we can affect it. So in light of that, like I think we probably have to think of what are things that are under our control, either through policy or influence, and then what are the levers that we pull. But then to Sendhil's point, like, do we have enough information to pull that lever right now, or do we wait and see? That also then tends to put you in this place of like, well, maybe we never do anything because we're always just kind of sitting there dumbstruck by everything changing, and bad things happen before we kind of have a chance to do anything. That sounds like a really, really hard problem. But it's a really hard problem.
Can I reconcile the two views? I mean, I think you're obviously right, John, that like the complex, once the algorithms are built, so favors, exactly as Erik is also saying, automation. It's unclear like what massive subsidy are we going to put. We don't have the political will. But I think to Erik's point, I think we do have the ability to move that by going much further up the chain. I think we forget that everybody here thinks of AI innovation as happening at the big companies. That is not the case. Everything that is happening there is a consequence of fundamental research that took place as little as 6-7 years ago. This is not like somebody did research in 1978. This is like very fast moving. And if you look at how much CS researchers cost, they're quite cheap. And so you go back to ImageNet. ImageNet is by construction an automation task. One reason we had so much progress on it is we built like this Turing trap. We built into the architecture a sort of an incentive for research to do as well as it could on automation. There is no ImageNet equivalent for augmentation. It's just not there. Now, maybe if we had that, maybe we wouldn't solve it, but it wouldn't cost that much to produce that either. So I think that's a sense in which I do think there's some opportunities.
Let me just elaborate that a little bit. I've spent a lot of time talking to AI researchers, and it's interesting how powerful the Turing test is, either implicitly or explicitly in their minds. And there's a sense that the purpose of AI is to make a mimic of humans. And when I have the conversation with them that, what about doing something that no human could ever do before? And you're talking about augmentation. A lot of them like literally have like an aha moment. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that's a good point. We could do that. And they've sort of got their head down, their blinders, like, okay, I have to make a hand with 5 fingers and make it just like a human hand. I have to like solve this whole set of benchmarks that are all, not all, but most, like ImageNet, very much defined by what does a human do, and our goal is to match a human. That's a very small part of the Venn diagram. Most of the space of possible things to do are outside of what humans can do. Amazing as humans are, we have a fairly, finite, limited set of capabilities. And so that kind of, it's not necessarily the traditional economic tool like taxes that I've referred to, and subsidies and so forth. But having people change their mindset, actually, I do think it matters. And one of the first charts I put up in my talk was all those benchmarks being hit very, very quickly. I think that's an optimistic thing, because like you put a benchmark up there for a group of AI researchers, like we're going to hit that benchmark. So if Sendhil can come up with a benchmark for augmentation, it's actually pretty hard, but if he can come up with one, I bet you some group is going to hit that just as fast as they hit the ones that are based on automation.
And to double down on that, like now I'm half-time in a CS department, and the thing that is striking to me is how many CS researchers are looking for interesting things to do. I mean, you would think because so many interesting things are happening, but in fact, exactly because the benchmarks all have a similar flavor, there is just a yearning for that, something different.
And one more thing back and forth as we go back and forth, but you made a great point about measurement. Measurement is not just to see how you're progressing. It ends up implicitly or intentionally to be a target.
Yeah.
And once you put a metric out there, that's, people work towards that in businesses, the folly of measuring A while hoping for B, and in AI research as well. So the power of benchmarks is underrated.
Have you read this paper by John Donahoe? It's fantastic. You all should read this. It's a really good paper. He produces a very compelling case for why we've had so much progress in this field in the last 30 years. And his argument is exactly what you're saying, Erik, which is that we've had this common task framework and reproducibility. So, which is, we're all aiming for this benchmark. And if I do better at it, usually there's enough published code that now the next person can just build up from what I did. And so that's actually been a defining feature in a lot of the fields where things were successful, including, it's not in his paper, but if you look until like 2018, there was a field where we didn't make much progress, which was audio signal processing. And what's noteworthy about that field is there was no common task framework, there was no data, because it was all being done by these big private companies who didn't want to share anything. And their progress was much slower. And then we got some common stuff, and then suddenly it took off. So I think there is an element for the sociology of the science actually playing an outsized role in the production of the science.
Super. So I want to open it up to your questions. And at this point, we can be very free form. So if you have questions that are for specific panelists, feel free to go with those. If you have thought of some since the talks. Or if you have some kind of big picture questions, now's the time for them as well. So I think we have our first question. And
yeah,
we will see Sendhil at the next talk.
So I'm thinking about how the three complementary human skills, recognizing a task as AIable, steering the AI, and the judgment of whether they did it successfully or not. And it seems to me that to have the AI itself be good at recognizing if a task is AIable, you're going to need a kind of just a mass amount of surveillance data that the AI is going to be able to access. And I want to kind of get a sense of what we are thinking about from a regulatory and safety perspective with respect to information security and data privacy among people in this AI context.
I mean, I guess I was imagining something a little bit more mundane, which is some of you are probably old enough to remember Microsoft Clippy. Remember, you lived in Microsoft Word, and it would say like, "Oh, it looks like you're trying to write a memo," and then it couldn't help you because it didn't have a brain. It couldn't really do anything. I think that's probably more what I'm imagining. Like in your work, there's an AI that's kind of recognizing like, "Oh, look, it looks like you're trying to do this thing." here can I, here's a way to approach that. But kind of the dystopian version of that is sort of an AI minder in your phone that's always trying to kind of tell you what to do. And I don't think I'd probably shut that off right away. I wouldn't want that kind of help. But yeah, I was kind of imagining it's probably more like in a work context, it's recognizing things that you don't know or wouldn't necessarily know about or know how to do.
I agree with you, Sid, but I think that the really dystopian one isn't the one that you shut off. It's the one that you just start relying on more and more. Like with my GPS, I kind of like no longer, trust myself to overrule the GPS. But if there was a GPS for every decision, you really shouldn't say that to your son, or like maybe like it'd be better to go to bed now, or like why don't you have the other meal? And if after a while I started letting it make all my decisions for me and all of us, I don't know. That's the really dystopian one.
Will from Cornell, Wilson from Cornell. Thank you for the great panel. I actually have two questions. First one is for Erik. You did mention, Demis Hassabis quote that he's singling out GPT from other GPTs in a way. Is that something you observe in the data as well when you look at, productivity improvement? You do the same exercise to previous GPTs, general purpose technologies, versus, the current GPT. Do you see a clear pattern empirically? And the second question is actually more for Sendhil, but it's for all the panelists.
We need a Sendhil AI.
We've been talking about large language models as a representative of generative AI. Of course, there are video generating, audio generating tools that computer scientists have built for us, or private firms have built for us. In a way, we've been talking about the economics of AI quite a bit. Actually, I'm curious to hear your view on AI for economics or for social sciences. My co-authors and I have been working since 2019 on large generative models applied to portfolio management, managerial decision making, but we are not looking necessarily at textual data, right? It's more numerical data from the limited data set that financial economists typically have. It would be great to hear your perspective on that direction of research going beyond large language models. Thank you.
Erik, would you like to
Sure.
start with
On the first one, every technology is different. Every GPT is different, but there's some similarities that carry over, so we can learn. What's that saying attributed to Mark Twain? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So there, I don't expect AI or any GPT to exactly trace the same footsteps as the earlier ones, but this pattern of having a lot of complementary investments being important, and that does seem to strike me as a significant one, and therefore the productivity J curve, et cetera, and the effects being much more pervasive as a result. And what was the second question?
About like tools for within
research.
Yeah,
I wanted to make sure I touched on that one too. There's so many great tools. I refer you to Anton Koronek has a great paper where he reviews AI tools for economists and the whole set of things. Of course, it's changing so rapidly, as Sendhil was saying. We get a whole new set. I've been playing with Notebook LM, and there's a tool out of MIT called Underminer.ai that is also amazing, where you can help it gather all the relevant papers for a topic, have a narrative, and it points to the relevant sentence of the relevant paper for a particular fact, so you can make sure it's not hallucinating. And it's a big boost. My colleague Chad Jones is using 01, and I assume he'll be using 03 to help with theorem writing and so forth. Things that he says his grad students, who are pretty smart, would have taken weeks to do, can now be done in minutes. So there's just a big collection there that could turbocharge at least certain types of economic research.
Yeah, I would also say, most of the software tooling that's kind of emerging around language models, I think, is still focused on developers, like people building applications that, like agent frameworks, things like that. I think that there's been relatively less focus on building tools for researchers. Like, we don't have our LLM Stata or MATLAB or whatnot, but I would be surprised if that doesn't get built. Like, the tooling will advance, because I think right now when we're using these things, we're almost like back in the punch card era of programming. It's tedious, and kind of even trying to constrain outputs, like, please answer this multiple choice question this way. everything's sort of difficult. But I don't think that will last. I think it will become a lot easier over time.
So in Sendhil's absence, I'll take the chance to emphasize the point that he made in his talk that I think is extremely important, which is that there can be value to building our own, right, custom models where we can control, right, what goes into them, that we don't have look-ahead bias, that may also be more tailored to our tasks. And I think like a good simple example is back in the day, right, in finance, when we did sentiment, but we're not necessarily using the sentiment classifiers trained on the Netflix reviews that the computer scientists may have been developing. We had our own rudimentary, right, by dictionaries, the Laffer-McDonald dictionary, financial terms, because financial language was different from the movie review language, and so the types of terms that would be positive or negative may also be different. Again, very rudimentary example, but I think something similar can be applied to the current innovations in the current tools, where it is definitely worthwhile as a field to invest in adapting, tailoring, somewhat building the tools that are appropriate for our use cases as researchers, and I guess in particular as financial researchers. Are there any more questions? We still have, I think, 5 minutes. Even 8 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is James Baldi from Thunderbird School of Global Management. I just have a quick question on, granted that there will be constant improvements in the LLMs and LLM-MM models, and as well as enough enhancement in their validation methods, could AI mark the real beginning of, and now this is the frightening word, universal income? And it's been taught about amongst economists for many, many years now, but I just want to hear from you. Is this something that we're really scared to talk about these days? Thank you.
So I used to be not such a fan of universal income. And Second Machine Age, I wrote, why it wasn't a particularly compelling idea. If you do the math, it's very hard to make it add up. My views are evolving because the technology changed. What is it that John Maynard Keynes says? When the facts change, I change my mind. So we're not yet at a stage where we have like the level of productivity or income that we can afford, a robust basic income, or there'd be the political will for it. That said, if you take some of the more optimistic projections that I hear from my friends in Silicon Valley, or a few economists like Anton Kornek have talked about, then we should start thinking about a situation where we do have a lot more wealth and we are able to provide more generously. I mean, if you look at, since John Maynard Keynes wrote Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren in 1930, I mean, the work week has shortened quite a bit, and we are taking care of a lot of people who are retired in a way that was never done, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. A lot of children. There's a big chunk of citizens that are not in the workforce and are being paid for. So you could imagine that, rather than some sort of big bang where everyone gets universal income, you could imagine that encroaching where more generous benefits on lots of different dimensions emerge as we become wealthier. But I think it would have to be tied or both politically and economically to being able to afford those kinds of things. It's not necessarily as far away as it was when I wrote Second Machine Age 10 years ago.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So one thing I wonder about is these tools are developed by people in computer science. Their benchmarks are usually maximize a first moment, your ability to predict something well. But what we know in finance is that when you maximize the first moment, you often maximize other things that you didn't intend to do, thinking about long-term capital management type failures. Now, we could say, let's have economists develop fine-tuned models. That would be one way to mitigate this risk. But what I worry about, and I'm wondering if you all worry about this as well, is that we as economists don't always see them either. And how bad do you think this problem is or is not? And are there things that we can do as we go through our refereeing and making our own research that we can do better on this dangerous issue?
Well, let me just say a couple quick things about that. I do think that, you know, as the potential benefits grow, so do the potential risks, and we're having a lot of these exponential improvements and things that can be used by good actors, bad actors, or perhaps most concerningly, just unintentional interactions. One of the earlier panels that John and I were both on, Gillian Hatfield described how AI agents and human agents could interact, and you know, she reminded us of the flash crash, which all of you in finance are quite familiar with, which I guess agents, you know, automated trading systems contributed a lot to that. But it's not hard to imagine a world where there are more and more agents interacting with each other at light speed in ways that no humans can possibly understand or contemplate, and exploring boundaries or going beyond boundaries that we've ever measured or seen before into unknown spaces, leading to, you know, very weird outcomes. And humanity kind of has had a strategy over the past few millennia of inventing a technology and then getting burned literally or figuratively and saying, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to do that, and, you know, crashing, and oh, wait, let's fix that. And that works okay when the bound on how bad the damage isn't too great. But you know, Hyman Minsky described how that when the second moment gets really, really large, then you can be, you know, you can have some catastrophic outcomes even if the mean is very high.
I mean, you can also imagine some people have raised concerns about like algorithmic monoculture, right? If lots and lots of people are using the same LLMs or same AI to make decisions, you can get errors that reinforce. And, you know, so like imagine a world in which LinkedIn was sort of using one sort of evaluation algorithm for every candidate, and, you know, there was just something in your profile that sort of made you unattractive to employers sort of generally. You know, that would be a really bad thing. We don't think of that happening in a conventional labor market because we kind of think of errors as sort of uncorrelated or something. I don't know what the solution to something like that is, other than maybe to be aware of it, that there's this potential for algorithmic monoculture. I mean, I've been kind of surprised at how the frontier models are all like quite similar to each other, even though they're developed independently and there's ostensibly differences in the training. You kind of end up at the same place where they are all pretty similar to each other.
Yeah, the monoculture, I think, is a problem. I mean, when I'm feeling like a real free marketer, I think that once this is known, then there could be an advantage to having a system that, you know, zigs when everyone else is zagging, because if everybody's trying to go after this one candidate and there's someone else on a different dimension that would be a better candidate, then you can win in the recruiting thing. I don't know to what extent that you could have some self-correcting like that. So that would be a great thing for somebody to model the incentives for a monoculture versus the incentives to do something different. They may or may not align with the social objective function, and it's something that I guess is a research question.
Yeah, I'll just add that I very much share your concern. I think every time I referee or discuss a paper that, for example, uses an LLM to label data, I always ask, can I have a validation? Can I have some arrays label a subset of the data? Not going as far as Sendhil, right? Sendhil actually has like much more sophisticated validation techniques. And I think that's the promising part, is that there are people thinking about it and there are people working on it. And I think the important thing is for that work to keep pace with the adoption, so that we don't end up in a situation where we've sort of over-relied on the tools to the extent that we get disappointed in them. And this is not specific to AI. I think we've seen that with econometric methods, propensity score matching, right, when sort of into favor and then when out of favor. And so that is something that may happen with certain AI tools if the usage kind of outspaces the validation and kind of the thinking about how to make sure that we really understand what is happening, we're using them correctly. And I think that the fact that we had that first talk from Sendhil today showing us that there's a lot of thought going into how to use them correctly and how to avoid those pitfalls, that's the promising side.
I think that this is also like kind of an unpopular opinion maybe, but as referees, we can kind of ask for more because these things are computational. So if like someone was using a language model to label things, given what that takes to do, it should be perfectly reasonable to say, let me see it with 3 other temperatures and let me see it with these other 5 models. Not that we all want to write like longer robustness checks for papers, but I mean, it is just computational, right? And we should get to the point where doing those kind of robustness checks is very easy. Even, some of the work that I've been doing with, just having them play games, you really should do it in 7 other languages and, change all the context and change the stakes. And like, it's really trivial to do that stuff. And as the costs of inference fall, there's really no good reason not to sort of see how robust results are to things.
It's not the same as rerunning an RCT.
Yeah, it's not like rerunning an RCT or going back to the lab 20 times.
And I think with that, we are right on time to conclude this panel. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and for your excellent questions.